In the summer of 1981, a 10-year-old boy named Bryan Ingram went on a camping trip with his parents to a beach in southern Washington. 2 days into the trip, Bryan was digging a hole in the sand and he found something very peculiar. When he called his parents over to have a look, they were so shocked at what they saw that they immediately reported it to the FBI. What Bryan found that day turned out to be a crucial piece of evidence in one of the most bizarre mysteries of the 20th century. On the afternoon of November 24th, 1971, a middle-aged man wearing a pair of sunglasses and carrying a large briefcase walked into the Portland International Airport. The man identified himself as Dan Cooper. He purchased a one-way ticket to Seattle, Oregon, and checked in for his flight. This was in a time well before 9/11, so the contents in that big briefcase of his were never examined. He simply checked in for the flight and walked to the gate. A few hours later, Cooper boarded Northwest Flight 305 along with 36 other passengers. He sat in the very back of the plane in one of the middle seats and made himself comfortable. He lit up a cigarette because this was in a time when that was still allowed. Coincidentally, nobody else was sitting in that back row with him. Shortly after takeoff, Cooper summoned one of the flight attendants and handed her an envelope. She initially just folded it and put it into her pocket, but Cooper said, "Miss, you better look at that." The attendant cautiously tore it open, and this revealed a handwritten note that stated Cooper had a bomb on the plane. The flight attendant looked up at Cooper, and her face was white with fear, and he motioned for her to come closer to him. He opened his briefcase just a crack, which revealed 8 large sticks of dynamite inside. Further on in the note, Cooper made his demands very clear. He wanted $200,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. Upon landing in Seattle, he wanted these items brought to the plane and fuel trucks on standby ready to refuel the craft quickly. If all his demands were met, he promised to let all of the passengers off safely. The flight attendant who was given the note quickly walked up to the cockpit to inform the pilot, but she was careful not to appear alarmed lest she unnecessarily upset the passengers. Another attendant named Tina Mucklow sat beside Cooper in the back row, and she served as an intermediary between him and the rest of the crew. Later that evening, the plane finally touched down in Seattle. Authorities on the ground had been scrambling to meet Cooper's demands. 10,000 $20 bills had been gathered from a nearby bank, and a sporting goods store had provided the parachutes, both of which were waiting on the runway. Most of the passengers didn't even have any inkling as to what had happened, and they marched off the plane, blissfully unaware. It really makes you wonder what near-death experiences we've encountered in our own lives, without ever being aware of them. Once all the passengers were safely off the plane, Mucklow handed Cooper another briefcase with the cash. Cooper opened it up, examined the bills, and nodded in approval. Once he'd ensured that the cash and the parachutes were in order, Cooper demanded to be flown to Mexico City. He wanted the landing gear down the whole way, the flaps at 15 degrees, the altitude below 10,000 feet, and very strangely, he wanted that main stairway underneath the fuselage extended for the entirety of the flight. The crew informed him that they would not be able to fly this way and make it to Mexico City direct. They'd have to make a fuel stop, and they wouldn't be able to take off with the stairway extended at all. After some deliberation, they agreed on a refueling stop in Reno, Nevada, and Cooper agreed to take off without the stairway extended under the condition that Mucklow show him how to operate it once they were in the air. After refueling, the plane was back up in the air by 7:36 p.m. Cooper ordered the lights shut off, and he then told Mucklow to go to the cockpit and not bother him for the rest of the flight. As Mucklow walked up to the cockpit, she looked back one final time and saw the silhouette of Cooper standing in the aisle. 3 hours later, the plane touched down in Reno. The crew returned to the back of the aircraft to check on Cooper, but he was nowhere to be found. They also noticed that the main stairway had been extended sometime during the flight. The only explanation was that Cooper had strapped on one of the parachutes and jumped out of the plane. Once this news got out, FBI agents swarmed the aircraft, but they just didn't find a lot of evidence. Cooper had left a black tie, 8 cigarette butts, 2 of the 4 parachutes on board, but he'd taken the cash and the briefcase with the explosives. An enormous manhunt ensued. Based on passenger descriptions, the FBI produced a number of sketches and distributed them around the area. The next step was determining where Cooper had jumped, but this was easier said than done. The crew hadn't actually seen him jump out because he told them he wanted to be left alone. Besides that, the 2 fighter jets who were escorting them also hadn't witnessed anything. But the pilot of the passenger plane did report a strange vibration around 8:15 p.m., and he figured that this was probably caused by Cooper's jump. Based on this evidence, the FBI pinpointed the drop zone 40 kilometers north of Portland. They launched a huge force of helicopters and ground troops, but the area was very difficult terrain. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack, and they were also battling poor weather at this time of year. Despite a search effort that spanned for several months, the FBI never found any clues of D.B. Cooper's whereabouts. With no success finding the man, the FBI turned their attentions to the ransom money. The cash had come from Seattle First National Bank, and they had recorded the serial numbers of all 10,000 bills before they were handed to Cooper. They wanted to make it as difficult as possible for him to actually spend the money. The FBI even offered a $25,000 reward for anyone who could produce just a single bill matching one of the serial numbers in question, but for the next decade, they came up empty-handed. In the summer of 1981, a 10-year-old boy named Bryan Ingram went on a camping trip with his parents along a beach called Tina Bar in southern Washington. Ingram was digging in the sand, preparing to make a campfire, when he found something very strange. It was 3 bundles of cash totaling $5,800. His parents quickly brought the money to the FBI, and sure enough, all the serial numbers matched the ransom cash that had been given to Cooper nearly 10 years earlier. But the cash only raised more questions about the mystery, mainly how it had ended up 27 kilometers from the supposed drop zone. Either the FBI had been searching in the totally wrong area, or maybe the cash had traveled down a river over time. But the most interesting thing about the bundles of cash was the fact that the rubber bands holding them together were still completely intact. Had the bundles been left out in the sun, the bands would have deteriorated in under a year, so the only plausible explanation is that they were intentionally buried either by Cooper himself or perhaps someone who found his remains shortly after the jump. This then begs the question, did Cooper survive the jump? Because the way the money was found seems to demand human intervention. After Ingram made the discovery, the area around Tina Bar was thoroughly searched, but to this date, no additional cash or signs of Cooper have ever been found. Most experts assume Cooper didn't survive the jump. That night, there was a severe rainstorm at near freezing temperatures, and the plane was traveling at 10,000 feet above ground at a speed that was far too great for a safe jump. Besides that, Cooper was wearing a business suit, so he certainly wasn't dressed for the occasion. It was also cloudy and dark when he jumped, so he wouldn't have been able to see his drop zone. Even if he had been able to see it, his parachute was not steerable. The FBI assumed that he'd ordered 4 chutes, 2 main and 2 reserve, to bring a hostage with him, and that's why they decided against sabotaging the chutes, because they didn't want to put an innocent life at risk. Of the 2 main chutes, Cooper actually opted to use the older, less technologically advanced model. We don't know just how competent Cooper was with parachutes. This choice could indicate a lack of experience, but there's also another way to interpret the information. The chute he chose was a military model from the early 1960s, so maybe Cooper chose it because he had some experience with that model. Maybe he'd been trained as a paratrooper in the past. There were other clues that Cooper had a military background. When the plane was circling Seattle waiting to land, he mentioned that the McChord Air Force Base was just 20 minutes away, and he was right. Also, the aircraft was a Boeing 727, and this model was used by the CIA to drop agents and supplies during the Vietnam War. Maybe he was familiar with this type of plane, and that's why he chose the flight that he did. If there's one thing we do know, the fact that the flight was run by Northwest Airlines was just a coincidence. When Tina Mucklow asked Cooper why he was doing this, he replied, "It's not because I have a grudge towards your airline, it's just because I have a grudge in general." He went on to say that Flight 305 happened to be in the right place at the right time. In spite of this apparent coincidence, Cooper came very well prepared. He demonstrated extensive knowledge of aircraft and aviation and clearly knew the local terrain very well. He kept a low profile through the flight so he wouldn't alarm the other passengers, and he left behind few physical clues to make tracking him down much more difficult. I believe he also intentionally demanded 4 parachutes. He likely knew that the FBI would assume he was taking a hostage with him and that this would prevent them from tampering with the chutes. Assuming that Cooper did survive the jump, he would have had to hike through miles of snowy forest in nothing more than a pair of loafers and a trench coat. That, combined with the weather and the speed the plane was traveling, does make his survival seem like a bit of a stretch, but the FBI never did receive a missing person report with a description that matched Cooper. That fact, along with the buried cash found in 1980, makes a pretty strong argument that maybe he did survive somehow. So, who was Dan Cooper? Within days of the incident, the FBI launched a massive investigation. They found a man in Portland with the initials DB and last name Cooper. Though he was quickly proved to not be the suspect, a news outlet made a mistake and claimed that DB Cooper was the pseudonym used by the Skyjacker, and the rest is history. Dan Cooper was almost certainly a false identity, but the name does leave us with a few clues. There was a popular French-Canadian comic series in the 1970s about a pilot by the name of Dan Cooper, so it's possible the Skyjacker was a bilingual Canadian. He was also described as having no accent by the flight attendants, but Canadian and American accents can be difficult to tell apart. Although I'm Canadian, and when I moved to Tennessee, I heard all about my funky enunciations from my American friends, but I noticed within a year of living there, I wasn't hearing about it anymore because my accent had worn off. So I suspect if Cooper was Canadian, he had been living in the US for a long period of time. There's another clue into Cooper's nationality. When he was telling the crew about his demands, he clearly stated that he wanted $200,000 in American currency. Now, when was the last time you heard an American citizen differentiate their money with the rest of the world? Never, right? It's been over half a century since the mysterious disappearance of DB Cooper. In that time, thousands of people suspected of being the real man have been questioned. I, of course, can't cover all of them. Well, I guess I could, but this would just be a really long episode. But I am going to tell you about a few of the most interesting ones. Robert Rackstraw was first suspected in 1978. He was a decorated Army paratrooper, helicopter pilot, experienced with explosives, and had a previous criminal record. On top of that, he had a skydiving uncle named John Cooper and was dishonorably discharged from the military just 5 months before the hijacking, so he had a pretty clear motive. When questioned on his deathbed in 2019, he neither denied nor admitted to being DB Cooper. But in spite of this evidence, he had light-colored eyes, which Cooper did not, and he would have only been 28 years old at the time of the hijacking, which the crew agreed was too young. But hey, he could have just looked older, like I'm 25 and I've looked about 10 years older for the past 10 years. Kenneth Christensen also served as a paratrooper. He worked as a mechanic for Northwest Airlines before and after the hijacking. He was 45 years old in 1971, so around the right age, and he was also left-handed, which Cooper may have been as well. The flight attendants reported that Cooper had primarily used his left hand to examine his briefcase. Before he died, Christensen told his brother that he had a secret. Although he never shared that secret, his family was very surprised to find over $200,000 in his bank account after he died. On top of this, he resembled DB Cooper. The flight crew said that his facial features were almost uncanny, but he didn't match some of the other physical descriptions quite as well. Christensen was reportedly shorter, had a lighter complexion, and significantly less hair. Man, if I had a sponsorship for Keeps right now, that would have been a perfect segue. Keeps, please hit me up. Richard McCoy had served in the Vietnam War as a demolitions expert and a helicopter pilot. He became a household name when he hijacked a Boeing 727 and parachuted out in 1972. As a part of this operation, he used the pseudonym, explosives, handwritten notes, and the phrase, "no funny business," when speaking with the crew, which DB Cooper had also said. He demanded $500,000 in cash and 4 parachutes. This guy McCoy did survive the jump and evaded authorities for 2 days before he was captured and sentenced to 45 years in prison. On his deathbed, he refused to confirm his true identity. Now, this sounds pretty compelling, but on the flip side, he appeared to be a very experienced skydiver, which Cooper likely was not. McCoy had even boarded his flight with a full jumpsuit and a helmet. That must have been a little suspicious to the crew. He was also only 29 years old in 1971 and didn't much resemble Cooper. It's very possible that he could have just read about DB Cooper in the news and then decided to copy him. A man named Dwayne Weber died in 1995. After his death, his wife revealed some very interesting facts about his life. Not only had he admitted to his wife that he was in fact DB Cooper, he owned a bank bag very similar to the one that Cooper carried. He had sustained a knee injury from jumping out of a plane sometime in the 1970s. He paid a visit to Tina Bar 1 year before the cash was found there. He was also a World War II vet with a criminal record, would have been 47 years old in 1971, and matched Cooper's physical description. But in spite of all these clues, none of his fingerprints were found on the plane. Of course, we don't know for sure that the real Cooper actually left any prints. Maybe he was smart enough to wear gloves. Weber's DNA did not match the samples that were found on Cooper's tie, but again, we don't know for sure that was the correct DNA. The best piece of evidence, the 8 cigarette butts that Cooper left on the plane, would have almost certainly contained the correct DNA, but they were very mysteriously lost during the investigation. William Smith had a military background. He was 43 years old in 1971 and matched the physical description. He also had a high school friend named Daniel Cooper who was killed in World War II. Smith had spent his whole career working for a railroad company, but the year before the hijacking, his company went bankrupt and he lost his job, so he would have had a motive. Perhaps he was angry at the airline industry for pushing railroads into oblivion. Upon investigation of the tie left by Cooper, detectives found that it was covered in tiny little particles of titanium. Now, most regular people wouldn't have any reason to come in contact with particles of titanium, so Cooper likely worked in a machinist shop, or maybe a railway yard. All 5 of these men have compelling reasons to believe that they were the real D.B. Cooper, but without a clear piece of evidence connecting one of them to Flight 305, we can't be sure. In 2016, the FBI finally admitted defeat and officially closed the case, unsolved. Unless someone finds the rest of the cache or the remains of Cooper somewhere in the forests of the Northwest, we'll likely never know the truth. So did D.B. Cooper survive the jump from the plane that night? I honestly have no idea, and nobody else knows either, but without clear evidence that he died, the legend will live on. Thanks for listening.